Well, Helen Ann, the summit's up and running. It's been quite the spectacle, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been quite full on. And it's been fun.
It has, yeah. It started at the airport for me.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to report I now appear to be the star of Chinese TV. There were some local TV outfit were filming people. And there I am, slap bang in the middle of this video, doing a bit of Chinese, actually.
Yeah, go on.
Well, I tell you what. I'll tell you what it was, and then we can play the tape. Ji Li Huan Ying.
Yeah, but on the tape you say Zhili Huangyong.
We're now at Beijing Capital International Airport. The aircraft of United States President Donald Trump will arrive here shortly.
American journalists have also arrived in large numbers.
I'll take your word for it, but of course you've had your moment as well.
Yeah, exactly. Going accidentally viral on Chinese social media is almost like a badge of honour. I had this quite funny situation. It was around the massive military parade that the Chinese held in September last year, and I did this broadcast, and it was a 3.5 minute broadcast, and I started off by doing sort of 20 seconds at the top where I just reflected on how impressive the spectacle was, because these things always are. And I was well, the sounds and the sights and the precision. And then in the back half of the second 3 minutes, spoke about the geopolitics and the dictators and whatever. But someone on Chinese social media just clipped up the bit of me at the top, basically going on about how brilliant it was. And I went viral as this kind of mega China supporter. It did wonders for my relationship with my government handlers, though.
Yeah, propaganda.
Yeah.
I'm James Matthews in Beijing.
And I'm Helen Ann Smith, Asia correspondent in the same place, my home patch.
Yeah, your patch. The Superpower Summit. As we record, day one is coming to a close. Trump has been laying on the love for his Chinese host.
President Xi was keeping it strictly business, as he always does. Taiwan was high on his agenda, and he was notably pointed in his language. We'll digest how the US president has fared on the first of his 2-day China tour.
So, Helen Ann, the airport, Donald Trump arrived on Air Force One, Beijing students chanting, welcome, welcome, warm welcome, they pronounced it correctly, flags, American Chinese flags, military band, stiff-backed, quite the pomp and circumstance. That was last night. Today we saw something similar, larger scale actually, in Tiananmen Square, and quite a sight.
Yeah, quite a sight. I was really watching closely as to what level of welcome they would give Donald Trump, because here in China, these things are never an accident. They always think very carefully about who is coming and exactly the level of respect that they, are deemed to deserve. And actually, Donald Trump was given, I think, sort of the highest ceremonial welcome, if you like. He had the full honour guard, troop inspection, gun salute, national anthem. He had the works. And that location as well, the Great Hall of the People, it's kind of China's equivalent of the Capitol building. But it's immense. It is a massive building, and it was built in the 1950s by Chairman Mao, shortly after the sort of communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. And the idea when it was built was to make a big statement about the permanence and the power of the Chinese Communist Party. And I wonder if Donald Trump absorbed a bit of that this morning when he arrived.
Yeah, I wonder if the location meant much to him, because in 1989, Helen Ann, as we both know, that's Tiananmen Square. And that road, I think it's Chang'an Avenue, is it?
Chang'an, yeah.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah. The road that goes past, and that's the road that goes by, that big portrait of Chairman Mao. That's the very road where Tank Man stood. That man during those student protests with the two plastic bags standing in front of that line of tanks. So, this is a place, as we've discussed, with a haunted history. And I think anyone watching that on TV in 1989, as I did and many others did, has struggles to get past that, actually. And it's certainly reflective of the China that it was then, and in many ways the China that it is today. But anyway, that was the location. The Great Hall, as you say, quite opulent, and the scene of very warm words, certainly from Donald Trump. He was full of flattery. Trump, the businessman, that's how he does business. He spoke about Xi being the great leader, and just very effusive. I wonder how that kind of patter lands with the Chinese? Do you think it does?
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because what I think we really saw today was both sides laying on the flattery in the way that they knew how to do it, right? So from the Chinese side, laying on the flattery is exactly about the performance, isn't it? It's about the guards, it's about the staging, the cheering children. Actually, Trump, I think, particularly enjoyed that. He not only stopped and watched them, but then he actually brought it up in his comments at the beginning. But Trump does politics in a different way. And this is not just a Trump versus Xi thing. I think this is really a sort of a Chinese political culture versus American political culture. I think we saw them on display in terms of just how starkly different they are, didn't we? So if China wants to show that they are showing respect and that they are welcoming Trump, they did so via the performance. Trump wanted to show his respect via some sort of quite freewheeling comments in his opening statements. He obviously went off script, said some things that, you know, he was complimentary, of course, but he said some things in a way that I wondered if it made the Chinese cringe a little bit. There was one moment where he said, I think he said, you know, President Xi is a really great leader. I tell everyone that. So some people don't like to hear it, but I tell them anyway. And I just wonder whether slightly the Chinese were thinking, come on. But that was his way of doing flattery.
Yeah. Just to jump back outside of that building for a second, Helen Ann, there was the political lineup, wasn't there, of the Trump administration. Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, and others were in the front row. The second row had the tech bros, you know, this Team America that Trump had flown with him on Air Force One, Tim Cook, Apple CEO, and others. Elon Musk was there. And interestingly, you know, I saw him, he was taking video, seemed to be shooting video with his phone. And I'll tell you, he's the only American I saw with a phone today, which is probably no surprise because I'm led to believe there's been a directive they must not bring their phones to China for the danger of having them hacked. So Donald Trump has been very quiet, actually, on Truth Social. We've been trying to find out, you know, what he's been tweeting, what he's been posting, but there's been nothing for hours, and that can only be because his phone is back home.
Right, and it's interesting because Elon Musk has a long history in China. He's been here many, many times before. His big Tesla factories are here. The Chinese are big fans of Elon Musk, actually, it's just worth saying. So he kept his phone because he's maybe got a Chinese account set up already or something.
Yeah, but these entrepreneurs, you know, they clearly carry power and influence with them. And, you know, probably the ultimate lobbying organization to take on the plane with you. They are also middlemen, aren't they, between the United States and the Chinese, and probably well placed to almost as middlemen negotiators in terms of bringing America and China back together on business, which is what this has been largely about for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think those CEOs are useful and effective, actually, in that sense, because coming into this summit, I mean, we've spoken so much, haven't we, in recent days, and on the podcast last time about the big geopolitical issues, Taiwan and Iran, and we will get on to talk about that. But actually, we haven't paid as much attention to the trade and the business and the investment conversations, which actually I think for the two leaders were an enormously significant part of this and is almost certainly where the progress is going to be. And it's still at the point of us recording. We haven't had all the details out yet about who's buying what and what investments are being made. And I'm sure that will come in the days ahead of us. But actually, I think it's worth noting that even getting off the plane yesterday, Trump came first, of course. Then he was followed by his son and his daughter-in-law. And then behind them was Elon Musk and Jensen Huang. And of course, people know who Elon Musk is, but Jensen Huang, such an important character in this. He's the CEO of NVIDIA, that crucial high-end AI chips company. They make the best in the world. The Chinese would like significantly more access to those chips. Part of the big negotiation of the last day or so is whether they're going to be allowed access to that. So the fact that Jensen Huang was there, really, really important. But as you say, I think there will be business done. I think we will see some, big purchases of Boeing aircraft, for example, perhaps big purchases of soybeans, various investment agreements. I think we will see some of that.
Trump, as we've said, Helen Ann, was effusive, very complimentary. He came away with, a phrase that actually stood out. I'm not going to try and pronounce it. It started with a TH. Your turn.
Yeah, Thucydides trap.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, you're quite right about that more measured approach. Xi Jinping's opening remarks, absolutely scripted. Whereas Trump sort of freewheeled into the flattery, Xi Jinping spoke about the future of humanity resting on their sort of good relations, much more serious, as is the Chinese political style. But really interesting, I think, that he brought up this issue of the Thucydides trap. Now, question mark over whether Donald Trump even knew what that was, but what it essentially is a kind of a dynamic whereby an emerging power rises and challenges the larger existing power, and that theoretically that would cause conflict and strife. And she was essentially saying we should try and transcend that problem. But it's such an interesting framing, I think, because that is absolutely how China sees itself and sees this relationship, that it is the ascendant power, that the US has, in their belief, done much to hold it back, to restrain it, to keep it down, if you like, that the Americans, they think, aren't comfortable with the idea of the two global superpowers being equals to one another. And I think that is a sort of a fundamental misunderstanding that is quite deep-rooted in the Chinese belief. And they certainly see themselves now as equal to the Americans, perhaps even more powerful than.
Yeah, after that bilateral discussion lasted about 2 hours and more, the events moved on to the Temple of Heaven. Donald Trump was given a tour. It was interesting to watch that, actually, from a media point of view. Normally, with Donald Trump, it's well controlled back in in the States. Everybody knows the drill. There's access given to pool journalists, and it's an established practice. Clearly, the Chinese didn't quite recognize that and actually got very messy at one stage, trying to get into the various locations where they were. Local journalists, understandably, I think, sort of following on behind, being told, no, hang on a minute, White House only. So that was a bit untidy, as was one moment which I saw described by the pool. There was Secret Service escorting the pool journalists who had trouble getting into the temple because he or she was armed, and the Chinese didn't like that. So, there were these kind of teething troubles. As the day went on, we had a readout from the morning negotiations from the Chinese and the Americans. The Americans, they spoke about the whole business of economic cooperation. They said this: the two sides discussed ways to enhance economic cooperation between our two countries, including expanding market access for American businesses into China and increasing Chinese investment into our industries. Generalities, no specifics as we record in terms of what that will mean. They did speak about Iran, and of course, as we've discussed, that was one of the key issues, certainly for Donald Trump. The American readout says this: the two sides agree that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open to support the free flow of energy. President Xi also made clear China's opposition to the militarization of the strait and any effort to charge a toll for its use. So that reads like the support that Donald Trump came here in search of, essentially Iran's support to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Donald Trump came here looking for a win on that, but as we record, we don't have details of what the Chinese are actually going to do. The test will be their actions rather than their words. The Chinese readout was interesting, for a number of reasons. Probably Taiwan more than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I think if you put those two readouts next to each other, I think it's so fascinating just in terms of how contrasting they were. I think the two most fundamental issues coming into this summit, Taiwan and Iran, the way in which they were reflected in those two statements was just so starkly different. So you just explained there about the Iranian question within the American statement took up a reasonable amount proportionally.
Yeah.
In the Chinese statement, I mean, honestly, there was barely a mention of it. There was many, many paragraphs that ran through all these things. And then we got literally just this sentence right at the end. And it said, the two heads of state exchanged views on major international and regional issues, including the situation in the Middle East, the crisis in Ukraine, and the Korean Peninsula. And that was it. And, actually earlier today, I was a bit unsure what to make of that. At first I thought, I think the Chinese have not mentioned much about it because perhaps they just didn't want to humiliate their guest. You know, everybody knows coming into this that Donald Trump needed to ask the Chinese for help with the Iran situation, that he needed to ask them to leverage their influence with the Iranians to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. You know, perhaps the Chinese just, you know, didn't want to gloat, they didn't want to make a thing of it. But then once I saw the US statement and the kind of the sort of weight and the time that was given to that issue, I thought, you know, maybe actually the reason that the Chinese have just really not spoken about it is because they don't want to get involved, right? As part of their strategy, which we explained on the last podcast, is just to stand back and let Donald Trump make his mistakes and make his mess. They have benefited a lot from allowing him to get on with that and just presenting themselves as, aside from all that, as the more stable superpower, as the more grown-up administration in the room, basically. So I actually wonder whether the fact they didn't talk about that very much was actually very strategic and potentially gave them room to manoeuvre as well in future.
Yeah, reserve their position and keep their cards close to their chest. You know, if they commit to helping Donald Trump on Iran, then he has the Chinese in his pocket, and that's not a place they necessarily want to be. So a matter of strategy, I think. The language on Taiwan was interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, let's talk about Taiwan. It's the other biggie, isn't it? And the other way that the statements were so different.
Yeah. On Taiwan, the Americans make no reference to that whatsoever in their readout. Quite the contrast with what the Chinese had to say.
Yeah, quite the contrast. Look, we always knew the Chinese were going to bring Taiwan up. Of course they were. It's their fundamental number one goal and desire. But I thought the language was really, really interesting. So they said this. They said, the Taiwan question, if handled properly, bilateral relations between the US and China can remain generally stable. If handled poorly, the two countries will clash or even come into conflict. Now, look, I think in and of itself, that's not utterly extraordinary. We have heard strong words from China on Taiwan before. It's quite clear that that's a relatively straightforward laying out of what we know the Chinese position to be. So you might think, what's the big deal? But I do think for Xi Jinping to use language that direct, to use it in the company, in the presence of the President of the United States to his face and then include it in the readouts, you know, that is a bit of a shift, I think. And it really hints towards just a slight hardening of Chinese policy. And it matters because remember that China's playbook when it comes to Taiwan is about these gradual nudges, the gradual sort of moving of mindsets, the shifting of what's considered to be the norm. So just gradually introducing this type of language in the presence of the President of the United States. Their idea is that they sow the seed with Donald Trump, that reunification perhaps is inevitable, that it's obvious that the Chinese will not budge from that position. And again, it all comes down to that slow but sure undermining of Taiwanese confidence so that if and when the big moment comes, the Taiwanese think, you know, the United States are not going to have our back. Perhaps it's best to capitulate. That is the whole playbook. And I think we have discussed before how Donald Trump is such a golden opportunity for them. Transactional, respecting of the idea of a superpower's backyard. We knew they were going to push on that, and I think this is the evidence that they did. Yeah,
Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, he was asked about Taiwan by NBC. His comment was that nothing's changed. Our policies, he said, on that have not changed. It's been pretty consistent across multiple presidential administrations and remains consistent. Now, the difficulty is, of course, every time Donald Trump's asked about it, he is a president who leaves room for doubt about where America is. Interestingly, at the Temple of Heaven, journalists got close enough to ask both men, Trump and Xi, as they were on this tour, about Taiwan. And, you know, neither said anything, but both stiffened, turned and walked away. So nothing from Trump, but Rubio says no change. I suppose we have to take that at face value for now.
And I should add, I think it is probably one of the biggest points of tension between them. And crucially, that's how China is consistently now framing it. They are framing the Taiwan issue as a point of conflict within the US-China relationship. And they are doing that on purpose so that it becomes the US's business, so that they are inviting the President of the United States to have to engage with it, to have to, as the Chinese see it, move a bit towards their position on it in order for relations to be smooth sailing. That's all strategic. That's all intentional, I think.
Speaking of Marco Rubio, Helen Ann, I was interested to see him here in the first place, actually, because he's a man who, as a senator several years ago, was sanctioned twice by the Chinese, sanctions that prevented his entry into China. He's here, well, he's Secretary of State. They made it work. What they did was they tweaked the spelling of his surname, the Chinese. So essentially the paperwork relates to somebody else, enabling him to come into the country. But I do wonder if we saw the US Secretary of State, no less, trolling the Chinese on his way here. He was wearing a grey Nike tracksuit, reminiscent of the tracksuit worn by Nicolas Maduro, Venezuelan leader, when he was captured by US forces. And this was posted by Stephen Chung, Communications Director of the White House. You know, this is a serious summit with serious subject matter for serious people. Nothing, it would appear, is beyond the political laws for some people. Marco Rubio was actually sanctioned by the Chinese, Helen Ann, because he spoke out against Chinese human rights abuses. It's something that is prevalent here.
Yeah, it's so prevalent, and it is always going on in the background. And I think that is the danger for visiting leaders coming to China. And it's a danger really for all of us who do business in China or cover China. There are so many things about this country that are wonderful and exceptional and advanced and interesting and nuanced and brilliant. And there are appalling human rights abuses still to this day in many different guises. And almost all visiting delegations who come to China say that they will make a point of bringing up some of those cases. Trump insinuated in a few occasions ahead of coming here that he'd bring up a couple of particular cases. The case of Jimmy Lai, the jailed Hong Kong pro-democracy voice. He was the owner of Apple Daily, a brash pro-democracy newspaper in Hong Kong. He was jailed earlier this year for an unprecedentedly long sentence. His family say that it's politically motivated. He's a British citizen. I exchanged messages with his son Sebastian, who speaks to the media and who we have a relationship. And he said, "Look, people are really concerned about my father. He's in ill health. But look, I have to say, we know that Keir Starmer brought up Jimmy Lai's case when he was here earlier in the year. As I said, Jimmy Lai is a British citizen, and literally a matter of weeks after Keir Starmer was here and brought it up, the Chinese passed this unprecedentedly long sentence. So it just gives you a sense of whether they're listening to that stuff. Another case as well that Trump said he was mentioned, there's been a real crackdown on Christians here in China in the last 6 months or so. And there's a particularly prominent pastor whose name is Ezra Jin, who's been in the press quite a bit in the United States. Obviously, the plight of Christians here is something that many people in America care about. I'm also in contact with Ezra Jin's daughter, Grace, and she said to me that they are sort of overjoyed it was even going to be potentially brought up. But I just think I should make this point that leaders come here to China to, lobby for what they want, to bring up these cases. But there are certain fundamentals about China and the way that China runs its country that no visiting leader is ever going to change. And one of those things is confronting the system and the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. No visiting leader coming in for 2 or 3 days is going to change that. And I think that's a fallacy that people think they might be able to. I think certainly when it comes to voices like Jimmy Lai, whose entire modus operandi, his entire business model was to question and to grill and to criticize the Chinese Communist Party. And this is still an authoritarian system. It is an authoritarian country where there are a lot of human rights abuses. That's not going to change. And I think it's very important that we as journalists, that leaders who come here remember that, because there are still a lot of Chinese people who suffer under this system, even though there are many who benefit.
Yeah, and I think there has to be a value in visiting politicians, a value in pursuing the human rights abuse line with the Chinese, because, platitudes about partnership and working together and, let's get rich and powerful because we care about each other. That's where the debate has been today. It's all happy, clappy stuff. But when you expose the grim reality of China's human rights abuse, that places pressure on this regime that, for a visiting politician, can help to win a negotiation, can help to win the argument.
I think that's right. And I should make I just want to add one thing as well about people who come here and think they're going to change the Chinese system in some way. That metaphor actually extends to things like trade and things like Taiwan as well. So Donald Trump can come here, they can do trade deals. What they're not going to do is change the fundamentals of Chinese economic policy. So things like massive state subsidies for certain industries, like EVs is a big one. You know, the Americans have long said, and the Europeans, that the Chinese kind of contort the markets, that they make an unfair playing field because of these huge state support for certain key industries. The Chinese are not going to change that because a couple of leaders come here and make some declarations for a day or two and make some flattering statements. And I think that's the kind of the underlying point here, is that there's only so much ground that can be gained in summits like this. And yes, we'll get some statements and we've done deals on this and we've achieved that. These are still two fundamentally different systems. They have to find a way to stabilise, but they're not going to change each other. And I don't think that model of competition and sort of strife, for want of a better word, is necessarily going to change.
So, Helen Ann, a difficult summit for us to cover. Access at the best of times to a president of the United States can be tricky. You only get so close. Access to a president in China, a lot more difficult. And we've seen, it's been untidy at times.
Yeah, it's enormously difficult. I mean, I've lived here 3.5 years. I only think I've seen Xi Jinping in the flesh maybe once or twice, and always at these highly orchestrated events. So, yeah, what they call Liang Hui, the 2 sessions, which is their state opening of Parliament, or the big parade, and you only ever see him from very, very far away, and it's very controlled. And I think we did see a little bit of that kind of sort of tension within the system, I think, between journalists, certainly from the US, who are used to a sort of a free system, and the Chinese state system, which is incredibly controlled and orchestrated and paranoid, actually.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask you, James, do you think when you look at the whole thing in the round, what did you think of their chemistry with each other, Xi and Trump? And do you think that they managed to see eye to eye as leaders, which is probably going to be important if they're going to overcome these pretty massive differences between their systems and the competition between them?
I didn't see any chemistry at all, if I'm honest. I mean, you got Donald Trump is a businessman. He's Mr. Showbiz, the apprentice. He's a golfer. He likes to live. President Xi strikes me as robotic, a politician dedicated to the politics of his country, to preserving the regime. Absolutely measured in everything he does and says. And I didn't get any sense of connection between Trump and him at all. They have a mutual interest, sure, so they're trying to tap into that. But warmth? No, I don't think so. I mean, there was a handshake, certainly. Trump went in for the hug, I think. I don't know what you mean.
Well, he was certainly
touched his
sort
elbow.
of.
He was ready for it.
He was certainly doing quite a lot of tactile arm touching, wasn't he? And actually, it's really interesting. I think talking about that warmth, I really got the impression that in that first meeting, Trump would have liked that. I got the impression he was really trying to invite it. He was leaning in, he was touching his arm.
Yeah.
There was a lot of sort of, let's stop and let's smile at each other. I mean, I think it was a bit awkward. There is obviously a significant language barrier. The translators were not with them at every moment. I think that was sort of notable. And Xi Jinping, he's totally inscrutable, but he's always like that. And actually, it's interesting when you said you thought there was no chemistry. I don't disagree with you, but I have seen Xi Jinping look more serious and less relaxed.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So I don't think it was...
That was his happy face.
Yeah, possibly. But I don't think it was that bad. As in, I think... What I think I did see, and, maybe this is me overreaching and trying to read too much into Xi Jinping's face, and perhaps that's inappropriate, but I feel that there was at least a degree to which he was pretty happy this was happening. Certainly in the morning, I thought at some points maybe there was just a hint of a smile, just a hint of a kind of facial expression that expressed satisfaction at least. And I think that makes sense because, look, for the Chinese, the fact this summit is even happening is good for them. They are able to broadcast these pictures around the world saying, look, guys, we are the equals of the United States. We are an equal superpower. We have just as much ability to manage global affairs, and we should be taken seriously. And hey, look, he's coming to us.
Yeah, because Xi is a politician who faces pressures himself.
Yeah, enormous pressures himself. He, not in the same way as Donald Trump, of course. He's not going to face the electorate in a couple of years' time. In any elections, he doesn't get punished at the ballot box in the way that American politicians will. But the economy of his country is not in good shape at all at the moment, and it's probably doing even worse than the official figures show. So he kind of needs some of these deals and some of this business, because remember, people in this country don't vote. They don't have a right to protest. They don't have a right to take to social media and complain about their leadership. The contract here is that they have to be economically progressing, and they have to be feeling to be comfortable. They have to be able to be in jobs and feel like they're doing better than their parents were. If the party is delivering them economic progress, that's the grand bargain, that they will accept the fact that they do not have democratic freedoms in the way we do in the West. And if that bargain breaks down, that's when the Communist Party is in trouble. So getting his economy back onto a sure footing is important. And there is no doubt that Donald Trump and his trade war has hurt the economy here. It absolutely has. And Xi Jinping, I think, over the last year has done a good job at learning where to apply pressure, particularly the rare earths issue, these vital components that China dominates and America needs. They know how to find weak spots and sort of squeeze. But it's not been plain sailing for the Chinese. They need this relationship to be on a surer footing.
Yeah, a couple of things I'll take away from today in terms of moments. President Xi on the steps of the Great Hall, he did the old Paddy Ashdown, you know, that politicians thing where you stare out into the middle distance and point somewhere, anywhere. But the still image, of course, is you pointing into the future, leading the way. So I noticed that Xi was doing a bit of that.
That's a very, very Xi Jinping image, actually. Yeah.
Is that right? Media trained.
Yeah.
The other thing was, did you see Donald Trump when they served him the toast at the banquet?
Yes.
Now, Donald Trump doesn't drink. I do wonder what was in that glass, because he winced like a man who'd never tasted whatever it was.
And it did look very yellow and very bubbly. It did look like it could have been champagne. And I mean, look, we don't know, but if that's true,
things.
If they accidentally gave Donald Trump champagne, a man who notoriously doesn't drink, that will be seen as an enormous balls up here. I mean, really, for the system where every detail has to be perfect, heads will roll over that one. It really, really, really won't go down well.
I hope we're not missing that story.
Yeah,
Better get on
quite. Quite.
This summit, as we record, has some way to go. Tea for Trump and Xi tomorrow. Is that right, Helen?
I think that's right. More meetings, more chat, maybe more progress. Who knows?
Yeah, then Trump back to Washington, D.C., and I won't be far behind him. The next summit is in that very town on the 24th of September. Are you coming over for that one?
I would hope so, yeah. Trump said today that he has invited Xi Jinping and his wife over to D.C. at the end of September. So perhaps I'll see you then, James.
Well, I might see you there.